A couple of minutes to migrate from the waiting room into the main presentation. So we'll get started here in just a second. If you are not familiar with Click Meeting, you can chat in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner. You can also move the video feeds of myself and Dr. Vickers around your screen. If you find it annoying or in the way, you can change where we appear. And we'll get started in just a minute.
Somebody's typing.
Yeah.
Oh, they say there's lots of reverb.
Yeah, I don't hear any reverb. That might be an issue with your audio. If you have any audio issues, we found it's helpful. You can exit and get back in, and oftentimes that'll fix it. Usually it's out of my control. So if you have any issues with your audio or visual, try logging out and logging back in.
Can you hear me, or did I need to make mine louder, or is it loud enough?
I can hear you just fine, and people can adjust the volume on their end if they need to.
If I adjust the volume, does it do anything on Click Meeting?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. All right, well, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, welcome to this week's installment of our Florida Talks at Home series. My name is Alex Beal, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator for the Florida Humanities. Normally, Florida Humanities works with cultural partners across the state to put on programming like this in person, but obviously that can't happen right now. Our goal is to make this virtual series a weekly event until we can begin convening people once again. Next week's event will be on June 3rd at 6 p.m., featuring Dr. Tamika Hobbs discussing the history of the fighting against racial violence in Florida. You can register for this event on our Facebook page or on our website, floridahumanities.org. At the end of tonight's presentation, we have a very short survey. Before signing off, we would greatly appreciate you taking a minute to fill it out. If you have any questions for the speaker, please type them in the chat field at the bottom right-hand of your screen, and Dr. Vickers will answer them at the end of the presentation. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Lou Vickers, a literature professor at Tallahassee Community College. Dr. Vickers has written a wide variety of both fiction and nonfiction works, including the topic of tonight's talk, Weeki Wachee City of Mermaids. She's also been the recipient of 2 Florida Book Awards and 3 Florida Individual Artist Fellowships for Fiction. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Vickers.
Hey everybody, I hope y'all are doing okay out there in quarantine land. It's kind of strange, and I'm going to do my best to tell you the story of Weeki Wachee. And the very first slide here shows me when I was a little bit younger. The kid that I'm holding, this guy right here, is 21 years old now. And the 2 people that are flanking me, that's Mary Darlington Fletcher and her brother Ed. And they were 2 of the very first mer people at Weeki Wachee. And the occasion of me being there was, at the time I was working on a novel about Weeki Wachee, and I had never been there because I live in North Florida, and my parents kept us kind of close to home, and so we never went there. But I had seen a billboard about Weeki Wachee with the mermaid painted on it, and it really intrigued me and stayed with me. And so I decided I wanted to write a novel about a mermaid. And so I went down there to basically do research, and I ended up meeting Mary and Ed. And the reason they were there is in 1997, Weeki Wachee had a reunion. It was the 50th anniversary. And what they did is a lot of the former mermaids and mermen performed a show. And it was such a hit that they kept performing. And so the day that I went, they were performing. And so I met them. And when I met them, I decided, hey, I'm going to put my novel to the side because I want to interview these real, actual mermaids, and I want to know their story. And that's how I ended up getting into writing the book. Okay. And this next photo, for some reason it's not, okay, there it went. That photo there is Ed. That's Ed at a reunion, and you can see what a character he is. He was a big cutter. He liked to play, and he was a very funny guy. And I just fell in love with Ed. He was a great storyteller. In fact, I was at a show one time when there was a storm, and the mermaids had to get out of the water. The mermaids had to get out of the water for two reasons: lightning and alligators. And the day that I was there and there was a lightning storm, Ed told stories. He told stories for almost 2 hours to a full auditorium of people, and everyone stayed to hear him. He was a great storyteller. And that's a picture of Mary. She was a teenager when she started working at Weeki Wachee in 1947. She told me how she and Ed had gone out there to go swimming because Weeki Wachee was the spring that they swam at as kids. And they went there one day, and Newt Perry, the guy who founded Weeki Wachee and started it, had roped it off and said, "Do not enter." And so Mary and Ed went and found Newt Perry to ask him what was going on. And he told them he was going to sink a theater into the spring and start doing mermaid shows. And so he told Mary if she and some of her friends could swim across the spring without drowning, they could become mermaids. And so that's what they did. And they pretty much worked there for hot dogs and hamburgers, and they had the time of their lives. Now, this photo here is from Silver Springs. Weeki Wachee actually got started. The idea of Weeki Wachee got started at Silver Springs. Newt Perry, the man who founded Weeki Wachee, moved to Ocala, where Silver Springs is, in 1922 or so. And he started working as a lifeguard out there at Silver Springs. Okay. And while he was there, they immediately started doing underwater acts for the newsreels. So Grantland Rice was one of the newsreel companies that came down to Silver Springs in the 20s, early 20s, and they were filming underwater, and they had made a special apparatus that they could get a cameraman into this barrel-shaped thing, put him out there in the spring, and he could film things underwater. And the woman in this photo, I think this photo was made in 1928 or something like that, that is Newt Perry's sister. And she did a lot of underwater performances at Silver Springs. Now, this next photo is also Newt Perry's, one of his sisters and his wife. And they're underwater, as you can see, that's at Silver Springs in the 20s, feeding fish. So Newt Perry started developing these ideas about underwater performance in the 20s. Weeki Wachee didn't open until 1947, so he was developing his ideas about performance underwater. And the water was so clear there that filmmakers loved it. And so they did a lot of underwater newsreels from the movies. You know, they just showed newsreels before they would show the main event. And so Grantland Rice was the one who made some of these. And you can find some of these on YouTube if you get a little, curious about looking them up. This was a little bit later at Silver Springs. And this photo was made by Bruce Moser. And Bruce Moser became really famous for making underwater pictures at Silver Springs. And the blonde woman there, that's Ginger Stanley. And Ginger Stanley was also a mermaid, but here she's at Weeki Wachee, but she was also a mermaid later on. I mean, that was before she started at Silver Springs. She was at Weeki Wachee first. And this is another postcard. There's a lot of, if you go on eBay or any of these websites where they have old postcards, you can find a lot of underwater postcards from Silver Springs. And like I said, these were made long before Weeki Wachee opened. Newt Perry, and I think that's Newt Perry in that photo, they developed these ideas in the 20s and 30s. Now, this photo is a still from one of those newsreels, and it was called I think it was called Water Champions. And this person here is Newt Perry. You can see it's from the 30s. You can tell by the swimsuits they're wearing. And it might have even been like 1928 or something. This fellow here is Johnny Weissmuller, who had become Tarzan. He wasn't Tarzan yet. And they were chasing turtles. It was all about catching turtles underwater at Silver Springs. Newt Perry and Johnny Weissmuller were very good friends. And that was a friendship that lasted for a very long time. Even after Newt Perry moved to Wakulla. And this is a scene during a filming of one of the Tarzan movies at Silver Springs. They loved the location there. And some people, there are monkeys there. Some people think that the monkeys were released by the Tarzan crew, but that's not true. The monkeys were released by a man named Colonel Toohey. He had a jungle boat ride, and he put some monkeys down there. He thought it would liven it up a little bit. And those monkeys are still down there. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to make this work. I'm going to show you all a short video that was made at Silver Springs, probably in the early 30s. Let me give it a shot, okay?
Water photography in the whole of America. As you sail up its tree beaches...
Started at the beginning. This is an underwater circus.
The lovely stretch of water and woodland known as Silver Springs, Florida, is the most perfect setting for underwater photography in the whole of America. As you sail up its tree-bordered reaches, you're amazed at the crystal clearness of the water and the smoothness of the submerged limestone rocks. Today we're lucky enough to drop in while preparations are being made for a show, an underwater circus. And most of the props you'd expect to find in an earthly circus are being got ready for the depth. Setting up the scenery on the bottom is rather a wet job, so the stagehands wear tin hats to keep the water out of their ears. While they're going down, they get air by the pumpful. Every bit of scenery has to be weighted to make it stay put, and even the hot dogs will be heavy on the chest. Underwater acting is just one damp thing after another. In a maze of stakes and guy ropes, the circus is taking shape. We know what to do if we feel hungry, but what happens if we feel dry? For our underwater pictures, we've brought our little submarine camera. It fits onto a platform inside a steel cylinder, made especially to resist water pressure and the advances of brazen mermaids. Just as the props are weighted, so must the performers be. The anklets are just heavy enough to do what their parents found extremely difficult: keep them under. Even the garlands have to be made of leaden flowers. Well, now we're all set and the camera's fixed, so let her go, George. Swim up, swim up, swim up for the greatest, slickest, grandest, loveliest, daintiest and wettest circus in the world. Mussolowski, famous strongman, can raise anything except a couple of pounds in a hurry. Wonder if he's got any cigarette pictures. The hula hula, and her mother told her never to sit on wet grass. He's so strong he can break a promise with his little finger. And now for the most sensational, most stupendous, most ridiculous tight wire act in the universe, or thereabouts. Sit back and gasp at the amazing skill of these daredevil sprites. Did we say tight wire? That's not the only thing that's tight. Allez, up! La belle Maggie Smith. She started by walking on air and then on thin ice. But now she's as used to a wire as a telegraph boy. Did you ever see such a saucy seesaw? They may take a lot of money, but they can't take a single breath. Gee, that's a good idea. These hot dogs are made from water spaniels. And they say the hot dog man sunk all his capital in floating his business. My, my.
Okay, we're back. I managed to do that, I think, without screwing it up. And I love the narrator of those old films. He uses a lot of puns. They're pretty funny. And he made me think about some of the details that I forgot to mention about weighting things. Like you notice in some of those postcards, like the woman with the hula skirt, they would put weights and things, and the mermaids would do that later. And another thing, you notice the hard hat diver helmet that the guys wore. Delee Perry is Newt Perry's daughter, and she was still running the swim school he started in Ocala when I was working on the book. And she said she thinks her father got the idea for the hoses that the mermaids use and continue to use today from those divers at Tarpon Springs. And they use those same kind of hard hats with the tubes coming down to the top. And so that was part of the whole learning process Newt Perry was going through. So after he worked at Silver Springs in 1941, there's a spring near my house. It's like 15, 20 miles from where I'm sitting right now. And it's Wakulla Springs. It's where we go every summer to cool off. And Newt Perry was asked to come up there and run the lodge for Ed Ball. Ed Ball built a lodge out there in the 30s, and it's still there. It's beautiful. It's a gorgeous place. The spring is, gorgeous. And so Newt Perry came up to run the lodge, but he also, brought his creative spirit with him. And so he immediately found some swimmers from the Florida College for Women, which is now Florida State University. He found they have they had a synchronized swimming crew at at Florida College for Women. So he got them to come out and to do performances at Wakulla Springs. And so you can see this photo of some of those synchronized swimmers on top of that sign there at Wakulla Springs. Now, one thing that happened too when Newt Perry moved to Wakulla Springs, he brought Johnny Weissmuller with him. Johnny Weissmuller quit, they filmed at Silver Springs for years. And then when Newt Perry moved up to Wakulla Springs, they filmed up there as well because they were really close to each other and they knew a lot of the same people. Newt Perry was very involved in the film industry, so he knew like from the newsreels, and he knew the directors, he knew the companies, and so they brought the Tarzan up there to Wakulla Springs. And that was the film they made. This is an elephant in the water at Wakulla Springs, and that is Newt Perry right there. In fact, I forgot to mention in the film that we watched, the circus film, Newt Perry was Mussolowski. That's who that was. He was a big old beefy guy. These are some scenes from Wakulla Springs with Johnny Weissmuller and Jane and Boy climbing up the trees. And if you go on a boat ride down at Wakulla Springs, they will take you under that tree, and they always, point it out as the tree where Tarzan jumped into the water. Now, another movie that was made at Wakulla was Creature from the Black Lagoon. It was partially filmed up there. And the gentleman in this photograph has a connection to Newt Perry. He was a teenager in Tallahassee when Newt Perry moved to Wakulla in 1941. One of the things Newt Perry did is he went up to Leon High School and he brought teenagers down to Wakulla Springs to perform. He taught them how to swim underwater. He taught them how to do all those shenanigans that they did at Wakulla Springs, because they did the same kind of films at Wakulla that they had done back at Silver Springs. And so because Rico Browning was friends with Newt Perry, when the people that were scouting locations for the Creature of the Black Lagoon came to Tallahassee, Newt Perry asked Rico Browning if he would take them on a boat ride down the river. And when he did, they asked Rico Browning to jump in and do some swimming so they could kind of get a sense of it. And they loved the way he swam. And so they hired him to do all the underwater shots for the Creature of the Black Lagoon. So Rico Browning did all the underwater shots. And like I say, he had a connection with Newt Perry because he met him when he was a teenager, and Newt taught him how to swim underwater and how to hold his breath and how to do all those things. And they maintained a connection for a long, long time. There's Rico, and there's Ginger Stanley. And like I said, Ginger Stanley was also a mermaid, and then she went back to Silver Springs to work over there. And in this photo, she was also doubling in the Creature from the Black Lagoon. She doubled for Julie Adams, the star of that movie, the female star. And Ginger met Newt Perry. She said Newt Perry was scouting for mermaids at a beauty contest. And he came up to her and he asked her if she could swim. And she said no. And he said he would teach her how to swim. He wanted her to become a mermaid. And that's how she became a mermaid at Weeki Wachee. And then later she went over to Silver Springs and did a lot of activities over there. And she doubled in the Creature. Now, this was one of those underwater picnics that they had at Wakulla Springs. They also did these at down at Silver Springs. They did these at Wakulla and at Silver Springs. They had underwater picnics at a table. They also did a Thanksgiving dinner every Thanksgiving. They would go underwater and eat turkey, drink coffee, and smoke cigarettes for Thanksgiving. And how they were able to do that is the coffee would be BBs in a can, and they would pour it, and from a distance it looked like coffee pouring out. If they smoked, they had to take a piece of chalk and they would drink a slug of milk and then puff out the smoke. So they had a lot of creative little things they would do to pretend to be eating and drinking underwater. This is another shot from Wakulla Springs. You had the guys underwater fencing, and that thing in the background is actually an air station. Newt Perry had these air stations placed all over the springs at Wakulla Springs. There were 3 of them, I think, at various stages, at various depths. And when he was training teenagers like these kids, he would teach them how to go into that airlock because he was pumping air into it. And they would get in there, take a breath, and then they would swim back out into the spring and perform some more. Otherwise, they would swim to the surface of the spring, get some air, and then go back and perform again. They were not using the hoses quite yet. This is another photo at Wakulla Springs underwater. And there's Newt Perry himself in one of those airlocks. They ended up taking those airlocks out after a soldier got into one of them, and he didn't know how to, he almost drowned, in other words. And so they ended up taking him out of the spring because they didn't want anybody to get hurt with these things. These are the Tarpon Club, the girls from Florida College for Women out there. Initially, they put in a lot of synchronized swimming shows at Wakulla. And it was also during World War II. You know, the soldiers would come down there, and Newt Perry would put on these shows for the soldiers, and they would all come up from Camp Gordon Johnson, which is down in Carabel down there. So they would come up for these shows. Newt Perry also did some training there. In fact, a lot of people think that Newt Perry was, what do you call those guys? Not a CB, but the aqua dudes, and I'm having a blank moment here. Some people think he was in the military. He did not do that. He taught them how to do things. And there's films at the Florida Archives. You can see him teaching soldiers how to swim underwater and how to dodge bullets underwater and stuff like that. And there's Newt Perry with one of those. It's called it's like a photo sub thing. They call it the hole in the water. And essentially it was this round thing. The cameraman would get in there and he would be able to film underwater. And that's Newt Perry right there pushing him along. This was an underwater picnic at Wakulla Springs. They actually did a whole newsreel of this, and they just turned this one still into a postcard. And you can see the boys cooking underwater. They figured out how to do all these things and how to eat underwater. That's just a postcard from there. This is what it looked like back in the day. It still pretty much looks the same. It used to have, Wakulla Springs used to have a 3-level diving pier. They've knocked off the top, so they only have the top 2 now. And this is one of the things Newt Perry did. These women, as you can see, if you look carefully at that, that's a giant alligator, a mechanical alligator. Because Newt was always coming up with ideas to entertain people. And so they rode around on this little mechanical alligator. And this photo was also made at Wakulla Springs. You know, Newt Perry's really developing his ideas about Weeki Wachee here. And this photo was featured in National Geographic. These 2 girls are putting makeup on underwater. Painting underwater. That's a scene from Wakulla Springs, the lodge. And there's Newt Perry. Always joke that he's with these women. He's going to teach them how to become mermaids is what he's going to do. It looks like they have on weights, perhaps. Okay, here's another video. And this is from a beauty contest. Newt Perry staged an underwater beauty contest at Wakulla Springs. And let's see if this works.
Yeah. Florida, in case you didn't know it, has long been famous for mermaids, and the latest news of them comes from a place called Wakulla Springs, where they recently held an underwater mermaid beauty contest. When the judges had made their decision, the mermaids insisted that the coronation itself must be held underwater, so one of the judges, rather ungallantly smoking a pipe, went down with Miss Mermaid to crown her as desired. How does he keep the pipe going underwater? Ah, well, you'd have to go to Florida to know the answer to that one.
There you go. Okay, and the guy that crowned her, that was Newt Perry smoking a pipe, you know. Now, obviously, they made that in a couple of takes. So at some point, he was able to put some milk in his mouth and pretend to be blowing smoke out. Okay, now this is an early sign at Weeki Wachee because once Newt Perry was looking for a place of his own. He didn't want to work for anybody else. He wanted his own place. And so he had been looking for a spring. And this fella told him there was a spring down, you know, near Central Florida. It was called Weeki Wachee, but he didn't call it Weeki Wachee. He called it weekly washing. And it was actually Weeki Wachee. And later on, I found out that some of the mermaids, before Weeki Wachee became Weeki Wachee, they would go up there and do their laundry on the weekends at Weeki Wachee. So I wondered if maybe some of the locals actually called it weekly washing instead of Weeki Wachee. And as you can see, too, another kind of strange fact, it's all one word on that sign. And originally it was one word, but they broke it up into 2 words so they could fit it onto more signs because it was such a long name, Weeki Wachee. But this is what it looked like in the very beginning. And this was another still from a film that Newt Perry made at Weeki Wachee once he got there. And this was a brochure. And the mermaid on the bottom here, her name is Nancy Tribble. And she was another one of those teenagers that Newt Perry met when he was at Wakulla Springs. She was a student at Leon High School. And he met her and he trained her to perform underwater. And when he went to Weeki Wachee, he asked her to come down and help train the mermaids that he was going to find. And so she went down there and helped train the mermaids. And there's Newt Perry. And these are some of the filmmakers. They could be from a newsreel or they could be from a bigger film. And this is the original Weeki Wachee Theater. As you can see, it wasn't that big. It was sunk underwater, and it was pretty miraculous for people in 1947 to be able to look out into a spring like that. Scuba was barely invented, and so people weren't used to seeing into a spring. And so that was a really big deal. It was almost like going to the moon or something for them, you know. Some people couldn't even believe they were looking into a spring because the water was so clear. These are some of the mermaids. That's Nancy Tribble, who I mentioned earlier. She met Newt when she was a teenager at at Wakulla, and he took her down there to help. And here you can see they're taking some bottles of grapette into the spring where they're going to stash them, because at this point they're eating and drinking underwater. Okay, that was part of the shows in the very beginning, the eating and drinking underwater. And there's Nancy. She was a friend of mine. She actually lived here in Tallahassee, and I met her. She kind of lived down the street from me. And she was a really big help to me when I was working on the book. And this is one of the first color postcards that was made at Weeki Wachee, and you can see the underwater theater in the background. This group of girls here were called the Aqua Bells. And when Newt went to Weeki Wachee, you know, of course, he was looking for mermaids. And so there was a synchronized swimming group over in St. Petersburg, and they were called the Aqua Bells. And he got them to come over and perform at Weeki Wachee. He also trained them to perform underwater. So they all became mermaids. And this is a group of Aqua Bells, again, on one of the very first postcards that was made at Weeki Wachee. And this came out of the photo album of Diane McDonald. She was one of the very first mermaids. She performed there very early. As you can see, that says December 1947. The first show is in October of 1947. So they were down there practicing, and that's one of the mermen. And in the background, that thing right there, that box, is one of those air locks that they could swim into instead of going to the surface to get air. And that's one of the Aqua Bells. That's Diane. She was a very good friend. And this is an early postcard, people watching the show. And you can see everybody's all dressed up. People used to get all dressed up to go to Weeki Wachee and see the show. Now, right after Weeki Wachee opened, Newt Perry got a phone call from Hollywood, and they were looking for a location to film a mermaid movie. And they called Newt Perry and said, "Do you know any locations?" And he said, "Yes, Weeki Wachee." So almost immediately after Weeki Wachee opened, they came down, William Powell and Ann Blythe came down to film some of the scenes from Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid. And Nancy Tribble, who I mentioned earlier, she was one of the doubles for Ann Blythe, who did some of the underwater scenes, because Ann Blythe did some of her own swimming, but the mermaids, the Weeki Wachee mermaids, doubled for her. And there's Ann Blythe. She was the star of Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid. And these are the Aqua Bells surrounding her. They were all mermaids too. And there's Ann Blythe. Newt Perry taught her how to swim underwater. And she wrote an article about it after, and she said he could have it back. She did not like swimming underwater the way he did. Newt Perry swam so much underwater that he was called Mr. Underwater. He swam about 5,000 miles altogether underwater. He swam all the time. He was a big swimmer. And I love this scene. If you look in the background, you can see one of the doubles sitting back there. And there's Ann Blythe wearing her mermaid tail. And that was like a $20,000 mermaid tail. And once she put on a mermaid tail, you can't walk. that's one of the problems of wearing a mermaid tail. So they would have to carry her everywhere. And Ed, I showed him at the very beginning. He was a merman wearing the wig. He was one of the first people I met. He was one of the people assigned to carry Ann Blythe's shoes for her whenever she was filming, in case she needed to get undressed and put her shoes on. And there's Nancy Tribble. She's at the courthouse in Tampa. This was for the premiere. And they took a tank over there filled with water, and Nancy would get in that tank and smoke cigarettes, which of course they wouldn't do now. And she would eat and drink, and just everybody was just going nuts looking at her, because you can imagine a tank like that. There she is inside the tank. And there she is being carried by Newt Perry. She told me that in between, I guess they did several presentations, and she told me in between the presentations, Newt would carry her back to his station wagon, and she would sit in the car with her tail on. And she told me how people would walk by and see her sitting there with that tail, and they thought, oh my God, she has a mermaid tail. And she said they wouldn't even talk to her. They would ask Newt, is there anything you can do for her? Because they thought it was real. It looked very realistic. And in fact, that tail caused problems at Weeki Wachee with the bears. Apparently, after they would shoot, they would put that, they would hang that tail up on the sawhorses out there. And one of the things they had to do, I forgot to say this, let me back up a little bit. When they were filming Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, the fish left. The fish didn't like it. And so they actually went down river and netted a bunch of fish and brought them up, because they said the water was so clear, nobody is going to believe that this is underwater. So they needed to bring the fish back. But in order to get the fish to swim around the mermaid, what they did is they put fish roe. They smeared that tail with fish roe so it smelled fishy. And then the fish would come around her. But when they weren't filming, they would hang them up on the sawhorses to dry. And the bears came out of the woods one time and attacked the tail. And they had to shoo them off so they could save the tail. So that was a story I found in the actual newspaper. This is from a slide. People looking out into the spring, and we're still in the original theater here. These are some of the mermaids. I guess at one point they bottled up or canned up some Weeki Wachee water and were selling it. And here we come to another film at Weeki Wachee, and you can get a sense of what it was like at Weeki Wachee. So let me see if I can make this work.
Beauty in the deep, the fascinating beauty of the underwater world, where we explore the mystery of ancient fable. The fable of mermaids who live at Weeki Wachee. Two of the stars in this world's greatest underwater spectacle swim out to perform graceful acrobatic routines in the crystal clear water, set against the background of Florida's underwater Grand Canyon. Weeki Wachee is the largest single spring in Florida, pouring forth 168 million gallons of water daily, and always at a temperature of 74 degrees. In this magnificent setting, the world's most highly skilled underwater artists entertain daily in a performance of beauty and daring. Viewed from the new $1 million underwater theater in year-round air-conditioned comfort. The great conch shell at the canyon's rim is actually an airlock where mermaids await their cue, breathing air until they emerge to perform their excitingly beautiful routines. Thrills that have been enjoyed by millions of people. Underwater, The body is weightless because of the greater density of water over air, and these two charmers demonstrate their skill by going up or down without apparent movement, simply by controlling the body's air content. Now, a pretty mermaid swims toward the theater to give us a closer look at one of the most unusual scenes ever filmed. It's snack time, and this proves that fish do not fear people. These friendly little fellows have learned that every hour during the day, at every performance, food will be served, and by such a charming hostess. Mermaids get appetites too. This is probably one of the most difficult feats of all the unique features at Weeki Wachee, actually eating underwater. Drinking underwater too? Of course, but you have to be real thirsty. How was it? Now, a daring mermaid attempts a deep dive to the bottom of the canyon. She breathes hard into the mask to equalize the pressure on her ears. She begins her dive, down into the depths, 117 feet below the surface, equal to the height of a 10-story building. Inhaling the life-giving air from the hose, and then forcing air into the mask to balance the increasing pressure on her ears. For every 33 feet she descends, the pressure on her body increases over 14 pounds per square inch. She fights the tremendous currents surging up from the spring, over 116,000 gallons a minute. It's a battle every foot of the way. Now, at the bottom, wedged in the rocks to withstand the upthrust of the spring. Then, soaring up, riding the swift currents to the surface. Pausing in graceful underwater acrobatics, taking time to adjust gradually to the lessening pressure as she approaches the top. Floating in the luminous beauty of water and sky. One of the wondrous beauties of nature combined with skill and daring. Truly, beauty in the deep at Weeki Wachee on Florida's Sun Coast.
Okay, let me see if I can get back to the thing here. I did. That film reminded me of a couple of things. One is the athleticism of the mermaids. You have to remember they're performing almost 15 feet under the surface of the water, and they're staying underwater without weights. They're not using weights. They're using breath control to stay suspended in front of the theater windows. And it's very hard to do, and the water's cold. It's about 72 degrees year-round, so they do perform in the winter. But one of the things I found when I went down to do interviews, even with the young mermaids, the first thing they do when they get out of the water after a show is they get in a hot shower and they eat. They eat a lot because they're very hungry. It burns up a lot of energy. And also the other part is looking good. I don't know how many of y'all have tried to look good underwater. You know, opening your eyes underwater and smiling is very hard to do. I can't do it. I'm too claustrophobic. They mastered that. That's hard to look completely relaxed underwater for 45 minutes at a time. And they're using those, the air hoses to breathe off. Those hoses have compressed air, and they bite the end of it to release air. So they have to be very careful not to, blow their heads off with compressed air. So there's a lot of technical aspects to it. And like I said, the sheer athleticism of these mermaids being able not only to perform underwater like that, but then to do these deep dives where they go way down into the spring and then to slowly come up, because it is very deep and there's risk involved. So they all learn how to do that, and it's pretty impressive. One of the mermaids did tell me a funny story about diving down. She wore 2 swimsuits, and when she got down to the bottom, she took one of them off and sent it up on the tube. She sent it up, and so I guess everybody thought she was down there nude, but she was playing a joke on me. She got in trouble for it, but she did tell me that story. And this is a postcard. The fish were always there. They fed the fish. And you might have noticed there are no mermaid tails on the mermaids. When they first started Weeki Wachee, there was no material that was flexible enough to have a mermaid tail. Yes, Hollywood made a $20,000 tail, but that was Hollywood. As far as the day-to-day mermaids, they basically performed ballet underwater. They did all kinds of acts, eating and drinking, which again, those 2 things are very hard to do, and they do it like as if they look completely natural doing it. The tails came a little bit later when the materials, like lycra and stuff like that came around, and there was elastic in the tails. They could wear them underwater. I included this photo. This was the cover of the book I did with Bonnie Georgiadis, who really was indispensable to me on the first book. We did a collection of photographs, vintage photos, and they used this photo on the cover, even though she's not a mermaid. But this was one of the very first fashion photos made by Tony Frizzell down at Weeki Wachee. It was made there. And this was my friend Nancy, and these are the mermaids. And you might have in the film, they referred to it as the mountain underwater. And they actually called it that because the underwater landscape looked like a mountain underwater, or it looked like a Grand Canyon or something. So the landscape itself was quite beautiful. And there's Nancy, and she told me that was her favorite picture, and partly because she does look like she's flying. And she said the same thing a lot of mermaids told me, why they really loved being in the water so much. They felt like they were flying underwater. They got really into that whole silence of everything. It was very quiet, and it was just very peaceful, and they were very comfortable. Unlike me, I would not be comfortable. And this again is another eating and drinking thing. This is eating an apple. They didn't always just eat bananas. Bananas were easy to eat. I think they chose to use those for the most part in the shows, but they ate bananas, they ate apples, they ate celery, they ate watermelon, spaghetti. They ate all kinds of crazy things. There's the famous banana. And they really ate them. They weren't faking it. They swallowed those bananas. These are some of the mermaids, probably 50s, 60s. This was mermaid school. Of course, mermaid school didn't really happen underwater, although it did, because they had to train the girls to swim underwater. And apparently some girls, they would hear about Weeki Wachee and they would want to go become a mermaid. They had people showing up who literally couldn't swim wanting to be mermaids, but of course they weren't able to. This was the youngest mermaid. Now, this young girl, she never performed in a show, but I was giving a talk in Apalachicola, and this woman's son came up to me with this photograph, and his mom was 9 years old, and she was friends with Walton Hall Smith, who was one of Newt Perry's partners. And so she would go to Weeki Wachee in the summertime, and while she was down there, they trained her how to go underwater and feed the fish. And so this was the youngest mermaid ever. She was about 9 years old, and apparently her friend was about 8, but I don't have photos of her. Now I always say these are mermaids gone wild. They're got cigarettes in their mouths and beers. Now, I don't think the mermaids ever really did that kind of stuff, although some of them did tell me stories about living at the mermaid cottages. They had fun. This young person here is Ginger Stanley. This was back when she was a mermaid. And she's the one who later went to Silver Springs, and she also doubled in Creature from the Black Lagoon. And just an amazing person. This is the airlock that was in the film. In the film, it was covered with a big conch shell. And so the mermaids used the hoses, but when they weren't using the hoses, they didn't swim to the surface and get out of the spring. They went and stayed in the airlock. They would go stand in the airlock, and compressed air was pumped into the airlock so they could breathe in there. And then they would take a break, and then they would go back and perform. But that was the airlock. And this is the new theater, and this is when ABC bought it. ABC, American Broadcasting Company, bought Weeki Wachee in 1959 and built a $1 million theater. And this is the $1 million theater that exists today. And as you can see, they're wearing tails now, and that's the big $1 million theater in the background. And this is from inside the theater, probably not too long after it opened. It was huge. It was really a huge theater, and it's still there today. And this is my friend Bonnie Georgiadis. She worked at Weeki Wachee longer than anybody I knew. She worked there for over 30 years. She was a mermaid for about 18 years. And then she also did bird shows when they added those. What she's in right now is a thing. What they did when they built the new theater, they didn't want the mermaids just jumping in. They wanted them to emerge in the spring as if they were like born there or something. So they built this hole in the back of the theater, and it goes down about 15 feet, and there's like a 60-foot long tube attached to it. And the mermaids would climb down into this tube and then swim out into the theater. And they said it was terrifying sometimes because big giant catfish would come up in that tube. One of the mermaids told me her hair got hung up in the lights one time when she's trying to swim through there. So it took a lot of nerve to be a mermaid. There's the big conch shell that's over that airlock. And they would swim inside there and get some air. There's Bonnie on one of the props. When ABC came, they stopped just doing their ballet shows, and they started doing actual, like, what they called Broadway underwater. And so they had a lot of props. They did a lot of, like, full-blown shows. And this was one of the props, and that's Bonnie on this dolphin thing. This was from one of the shows they did called Alice in Wonderland. And that's a big crocodile. And they also did photo shoots. Anytime there was like Barber Week or George Washington's birthday or anything like that, the photographers would set up scenes underwater to send the pictures out to the newspapers. Back then, of course, newspapers were everywhere and they needed content. And so they loved getting these kind of photos, and they would run them in the newspaper. And that's how a lot of girls found out about Weeki Wachee and wanted to come down and be mermaids. And there's Bonnie playing baseball underwater. There she is doing spring cleaning in her tail. And that's another scene from, what is that from, y'all? Is that Alice in Wonderland? The rabbit. There's Bonnie at the Fish Cafe. And there's the twins, Holly and Dolly. And what they did for this was, during the 60s, they had a space show because it was right around, the time of all the space shots and stuff. And as you can see in the background, they turned the airlock into like a spaceship. And Holly and Dolly were twins who worked there. And this was from another underwater show. They told me that those hula skirts were weighted at the bottom so they wouldn't fly up. And this is yet another show. Eating and drinking on the water. You can find a lot of these postcards on old postcard websites or on eBay. Or you can look at them at the Florida History Museum. It has an archive, and it's called the Florida Memory Project. And you can also see films there as well if you want to look some of those up. And basically, once ABC bought Weeki Wachee, it became a huge hit. People were flocking there. They had a huge staff of mermaids. They were performing 9 shows a day. They had people lined up outside the doors to come in. And so Weeki Wachee was a big hit. These are just some more of the photographs underwater. Elvis Presley actually came to Weeki Wachee. He made a stop there. He was filming up at Crystal River, and he came down to see the mermaids. That's not him. That's a big paper cutout of him underwater. But he came down there, and girls from all over the country flocked to Weeki Wachee to get a look at Elvis Presley. And he gave all the mermaids signed record albums. He was very nice, but he wasn't that smart. Elvis Presley asked one of the boat drivers why they didn't put Weeki Wachee at someplace like Madison Square Garden. He didn't understand that it was an actual spring, a natural spring, that it couldn't be, this couldn't happen anywhere else but Weeki Wachee. And this is another one of those, photo ops for probably Camera Week. By the time I got down, things had changed. Disney was the big killer of Weeki Wachee and a lot of other theme parks. A lot of times, like when Disney World first came to Florida, everybody welcomed Disney. They thought it was going to be great, for the other attractions. And at first it was, because Disney World would close for the day. And then all the people that couldn't get in would go to the other attractions like Cypress Gardens, Weeki Wachee, Silver Springs. But then that changed. The bigger Disney got, and the more people would go there for longer periods of time. And so they would pretty much use their vacation time up over there. And so Weeki Wachee started losing ground. And things, got slow there. And they stopped doing 9 shows a day. And the people weren't lined up outdoors anymore. Now, like I said at the very beginning, when I went to Weeki Wachee, I met the mermaids of yesteryear. And they performed a show called Tales of Yesteryear, and this was the group of mermaids I met, some of them, not all of them. And this is a photograph of some of the older mermaids that were performing the shows. After the 50th anniversary, they became very popular. People loved these shows, and they wanted to see these mermaids perform. And this is one of the last photos from the time that I was down there. Now, what happened is in 2000, I think, somewhere in 2000, Weeki Wachee was in danger of closing, and they actually launched a Save Our Tales campaign. And they managed to stay open for a while, but then things started just kind of falling apart. The buildings needed repair. A lot of things were happening. So basically, it was a stretch of time, and it's a lot of ins and outs, which I won't get into here, but it ended up becoming a state park. So Weeki Wachee's still there. The theater's still there. They've actually renovated it back to its original look, and the mermaids are still performing. I'm not sure about right now with the coronavirus, but they have been performing. And that's one of the last slides. And so I guess we can open it up to questions. I'm sure I missed things, and you may have questions. And if anybody has questions, feel free to ask. Maybe I can answer them for you.
Thank you so much, Lou. If anyone has any questions, we'll stick around as long as it takes to get them all answered. And if before you guys sign off, just take a minute or so and fill out our survey, we would greatly appreciate it.
Oh, I see where somebody is saying that there's an oral history project to interview all the mermaids. That's fantastic.
Kathy asked, was there an underwater viewing spot at Wakulla?
No, there wasn't. That's why when Newt Perry was at Wakulla, he mostly put on the synchronized swimming shows there because, they didn't have the ability to send people underwater. They didn't have a theater there underwater. Now, they did film underwater shows there, but those weren't, you couldn't go underwater and see it like you could at Weeki Wachee.
Someone asked how long it took to train to become a mermaid.
I'm not sure exactly how long. I know initially with Mary, my friend, Mary Darlington Fletcher, when it first opened, they're, like she said, they had to swim across the spring and back, and if they didn't drown, they became mermaids. Now, of course, they had to spend time learning how to eat and drink and breathe underwater. using the hoses, and that took some time. I'm not sure how much time it took. I don't think anyone ever really specified that. And I know later on, there was a drowning. The women survived, but they almost drowned at Weeki Wachee. And after that, they all the mermaids are certified in diving now. That became a necessary skill to have, and I'm sure that took time to do that.
Any other questions?
I see some questions on here.
Yeah, we might have to scroll up here.
Let me scroll up here. Yes, there are still shows today. You can go. I'm not sure with the coronavirus, but it is still there. Oh, someone's saying that they haven't been to Weeki Wachee. You have to go. It's magical. Even in the days when things were a little rough, it was magical. And it's still magical to me when I see it, because these women are performing underwater in a Florida spring. This is a natural spring. It's super deep. It's very deep. It's beautiful. And it's just magical to see the mermaids perform. So if you haven't been, you should go. And also, now that it's a state park, you can also swim there. And they also have like boat cruises down, and you can canoe there. I actually did meet some mermaids there, and we canoed down the river, and you can do that.
Yeah, I was there maybe 2 years ago. I think it only cost like $13. This was a couple years ago. It's very expensive compared to some of the other stuff you can do.
Yeah, it's cool though. Someone's asking about there's a Springs, and the thing about boat rides and the thing about springs, Florida Springs in general. Am I still on here? Okay, the thing about Florida Springs is that, everybody fertilizes their lawns, and so all that water gets into the aquifer and it gets into the springs. So Wakulla Springs used to have a glass bottom boat, so people could go out like that and look down into the deep part of the spring, and they could see fish and everything. But because of all the runoff and all the fertilizers and stuff, the springs they're still gorgeous, but the water is nowhere near as clear as it used to be. It's got a greener tint to it. And so they do still run the jungle cruise at Wakulla Springs, but they do not run the glass bottom boat. I know they still run the glass bottom boat at Silver Springs, because I've been down there. Yeah, and somebody's saying, yes, all the springs are. All the springs. I think everybody should try to go see the springs once all this corona stuff goes away. Let me see. Am I missing something? Oh, someone asked how Newt Perry developed the skills. Because I mentioned that they did the whole, what are those people called? The aqua guys, the Navy, the SEALs. They were called something else earlier. Newt Perry trained them to dive. What they did is, like, if you dive underwater, a lot of times bullets will ricochet off the top of the water. That's what he trained them how to do, is to dive deep down, and they would dodge bullets like if they were being shot at. Actually, the bullet would ricochet off. And there's actually film of this at the Florida Archives, and you can even look at it online. And then as far as like what they did too at the training the Navy SEALs down there, the underwater sailor guys, they would have fires, and of course the fire would stay on top, and they would dive underneath and stuff like that. And those films are at the Florida Archives, and you can see them there. Let me see what else we have. Oh, someone says, I wonder if you can tell us how a mermaid gets old in Florida. Was your friend proud of her life? Did she have souvenirs at home? Would she tell? Well, the mermaids are all different. My friend Nancy, she loved being a mermaid, but to her it was just, she wasn't, and she had an amazing scrapbook, which I think she donated. She recently passed away. She donated that to the Florida Archives. But she did other things. Now, some mermaids, they tell everybody they're like rock stars. When I met Mary and Ed, I felt like I was talking to rock stars. And so a lot of mermaids do have, they have souvenirs, and they tell people. Once everybody knows you're a mermaid, then they all want to talk to you. You know, I've been at events where I've had, like, Diane McDonald came, and she's a former mermaid, and she's in her 80s, and they didn't want to talk to me. They wanted to talk to her. And so, yes, I think they like that. They like being, you know, they like people, because when they were doing it, they were just doing it. They didn't realize they were becoming part of, you know, Florida history. Oh, that's sweet. Yeah, there's a couple of novels about, I'm working on one, but I'm not done with it yet. But there's a couple of novels. One's called Swim to Me, I think was set at Weeki Wachee, and also Mermaids on the Moon. A friend of mine, Elizabeth Stuckey French, wrote a novel about that. Yeah, I read a novel called Breathing Underwater, but it's not about mermaids, believe it or not, although the mermaids make an appearance in it. And that's really a coming of age novel about my growing up. And you know, I did, like I say, I saw the sign about Weeki Wachee, and the mermaids just kind of stayed in my head as a kid. Just this fascination with people that did that for, you know, that did breathed underwater. You know, it was like they really did, because they had the hoses underwater. So no, there was no underwater viewing spot unless you count the glass bottom boat. I think someone's asking when they split the name up. Sometime after Newt Perry got down there, probably in the 47, 48, 49, somewhere in there. And they also, another little weird fact is they incorporated Weeki Wachee as a city. And the reason they did that is so they could put the name on a map. And I know that the state was trying to change that. But, oh, there's Peggy. But yeah, I think it's still on the maps. Somebody liked it. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Dr.?
If you have any questions, I'm not sure how to. I think I've answered some of them.
Yeah, and if anyone is about to log off, if you'd please be so kind as to finish filling out the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Oh, someone asked if there were any drownings or serious injuries at the spring.
Yeah, I mentioned. Yeah, there's so many stories, but in the 70s, and I think it was like 71, there was 2 mermaids that almost died. What happened was, I guess they wanted to swim, and so they weren't supposed to swim that day, but they jumped in the water anyway, and they went into an airlock it didn't have compressed air in it. The air in it was noxious. How that happened, I'm not positive, but they ended up going in an airlock with noxious whatever, and they passed out. And a show was going on. It was actually the one with all sleeping, what was it? Sleeping Beauty or something like that. No, it was the 7 Dwarves. And they thought that they were playing around. They saw them out there and they thought they were playing, and they weren't. And they got them out and they revived them. They actually had to spend time in the hospital. And right after that, the mermaids actually went to New York, where ABC's offices were, and they had a strike for more money and everything, and also for more safety equipment, because at the time they didn't even have like safety equipment there. They weren't, I guess, expecting anybody to drown. And after that is when they required them to have certification to be certified divers. And of course they have all the equipment there as well. And there's, photos of the mermaids striking in New York in their swimsuits. And somebody said the park is closed right now.
Yeah, someone asked how the water quality is there now.
Well, it's probably, they've tried to make it better. I know that when I went down, the mermaids complained about the algae. They called it scrunge. If you go down there, and maybe even when Alex went down there, the rocks and everything were covered with this really nasty looking algae, like brown algae. And they used to suck it out with a big vacuum thing. They've tried to clean it up, and the only way you can really clean up springs is if you ask people that live in the area to quit fertilizing. And the fertilizer gets into the aquifer feeds the springs. Florida Springs are connected to the aquifer. So if groundwater has fertilizer, it gets into the aquifer, and then it gets into the spring and the algae grows. And that's a problem. Like I said, back in the day when they were filming Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, the water was so clear that people just couldn't believe it was underwater. It was so clear it didn't look like it was underwater. Of course, the women's hair was floating up above them, but, people had a hard time believing it was real, Do we have any more questions out there?
Well, someone asked about manatees, but it looks like someone else answered it.
Oh, okay. Manatees do come into the spring. I've been there when they come in. I don't know. Do we have any more? Oh yeah, they do have kayak. You can rent kayaks and.
Someone asked, fertilizer in the water pose a threat to the mermaids?
Yes. That is true. Golf courses, all those things. In fact, I made a point when I was a few years ago when my kids were young to try to take them to we just went on a springs tour, and some of the springs are still very pretty. Unfortunately, there's ones like Jenny Springs, which is beautiful. However, there's like 4 million people there drinking and smoking, and so it kind of takes away from the gorgeousness of it, But there are some springs that are still crystal clear. You can find them, and I highly recommend, if you haven't been to Florida Springs, to go on a little spring trip and visit some springs. They're just beautiful. Somebody's typing something.
Yeah.
Are the peacocks still there? I don't think so. I know they had a bird show there at one point when they were competing with Disney. They started adding features to try to compete, and they had the wild like falcons. And Bonnie, my friend, was actually a falconer there. I don't know if they still have those. They were there. Actually, those peacocks were there when I went a long time ago, but I don't know if they're there now.
Someone asked if you're the Lou Vickers, the author of Breathing Underwater.
Yes, and that's what I was saying, that the title, everybody assumes it's about mermaids. The mermaids do make an appearance in it, but it's more of a coming-of-age novel. It's kind of semi-autobiographical. You can find out how crazy my family is if you read that.
And then someone asked about the Springs tour map.
There probably is one.
Yeah, I'm
not sure, but I bet you there is one. Yeah, somebody's saying they still have glass bottom. Yeah, they do have those glass bottom boats at Weeki Wachee, and they take them down the river. You can go on a little cruise down the river.
All right, folks. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we'll go ahead and call it a night. I appreciate everyone tuning in, and tune in next week as we hear from Dr. Tamika Hobbs about the history of lynching and racial violence here in Florida. It's a little darker topic, but it should be really interesting. You can register for this at our website, which is floridahumanities.org, or on our Facebook page. And we'll hopefully see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks everybody for showing up. Appreciate
Thank you, Dr. Vickers. Have a good night.
Okay, good night.